We sometimes talk about the Garden of Gethsemane, and already we have problems. In the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, we have Gethsemane. John gives us a garden. But let's think about that garden for a minute. It was in the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve faced temptation and they failed. But now at Gethsemane, in John's garden, Jesus himself will face temptation, and the temptation of the most difficult sort. Not one coming from Satan, not one coming from someone else, but his own personal temptation to flee or to accept the cross. When Jesus prays, "Father, let this cup pass from me," let's not pass over that cup too quickly. When we think about cups in the scriptures of Israel, we might think about the psalm, "My cup runneth over." We think of love and compassion and joy and happiness. But this is a different type of cup in Gethsemane. This is a cup of fate, of torture, of death. It's not a cup from which Jesus wants to drink. And we should also think about the cup that Jesus shared with his followers at his Last Supper. And when Jesus hands his followers that cup, when people participate in that cup during a church service, what kind of cup is one drinking? A cup of happiness and joy, a cup of bitterness, a cup of temptation, a cup of community. Think about the cup rather than just pass it by. In Paul's epistle to the Philippians, chapter 2, he has this beautiful poem, it might actually be a hymn, in which he talks about how the Christ was in the form of God, but didn't feel the necessity of grasping that divinity. But the Christ empties himself out, takes on human form, indeed the form of a slave. What does it mean to give up all your privilege, to give up all your power, to become a servant, indeed a slave for everyone? That's one of the teachings that Jesus offers, and more than just talking about it, he actually does it. When Jesus says, "Let this cup pass from me," he doesn't want to suffer crucifixion, he doesn't want to die. But that's not a sign of lack of faith in God. To the contrary, it's a sign of enormous faith. Indeed, it's what prophets frequently do. Jeremiah doesn't want to be a prophet. It's hard to be a prophet. It's even harder to accept the fate of a prophet. So Jesus, like Jeremiah, doesn't want to drink from that cup. And he recognizes he has a choice here. He prays to God to say, "Here's how I feel." And he knows that God will love him, indeed, regardless of the choice that he makes. And because he is confident in that love, he can choose the fate he needs to choose. Jesus brings his disciples with him to Gethsemane, and he takes three of them, the three who witnessed his own transfiguration, Peter, James, and John. And he says, "Pray with me, stay awake." But they fall asleep, and Jesus prays, and he comes back to his friends, but rather than watching and remaining awake, they have fallen asleep. "Could you not stay awake just a little while longer?" he asks. And he goes to pray again, and again they fall asleep. The insiders, the ones who witnessed him in all his glory, who heard his teaching, who saw his miracles, cannot stay awake, cannot meet his need. And the irony is that while the insiders fail him, the outsiders remain true. The anointing woman, whose name we do not have in Matthew and Mark, she represents fidelity. She's there, as Jesus says, to anoint him for his burial. And when Jesus dies, it's the centurion, the Roman army officer, who is with him when he dies and who is able to proclaim him Son of God. So the Gospels ask, are you an insider? Are you an outsider? Have you failed? Have you remained true? And if you have failed, if you have fallen asleep, recognize that there's still a continuation of your story as well. When Jesus goes to Gethsemane, he knows he is going to be arrested. He knows he is going to die. And this was his choice. When he prays, "Let this cup pass from me," he knows that that's a possibility. Indeed, he did not have to go to Gethsemane. He did not have to allow Judas to engage in the betrayal. He could have run away. He had a choice, but he doesn't. He stays to accept his fate because he has trust in God that everything will work out according to divine plan. When the Gospels were first taught, they weren't taught in little snippets or little lectionary readings. They were performed from the beginning to the end, as today we might, for example, see a movie. And what happens in the Gospels, as with any good symphony, with any good movie, themes repeat. Gethsemane echoes not only the temptation of Jesus by Satan in the wilderness, but it also echoes the Our Father. When Jesus teaches his followers to pray, "Lead us not into temptation," now Jesus himself is brought into temptation. He doesn't ask from his followers anything more than he himself has experienced and has endured. In Christian theology, Jesus is God, but he's also fully human, with all of our emotions, our fears, our temptations, and our strengths. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is arrested on the evening of Passover, and the Last Supper would have been a Passover meal, a Passover Seder. The Passover celebrates not only the exodus of the Israelite slaves from Egypt, but also the passing over of the angel of death, so that the Jewish children are not killed. And what do we have here in Gethsemane? We have a type of Passover as well, but in this case, on this evening, the Son of God, God's firstborn Son, according to Christian theology, on this night, he will be condemned to death.